Hey everyone. Tonight, we're rewinding to a time when cars were clunky, maps were rumors, and the world itself was a dare. A time when 6 brave, or possibly insane, teams lined up in Manhattan with one goal: drive across the planet. No GPS, no highways, just snow, sand, sabotage, and stubbornness. Before we dive in, tap like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories about impossible dreams and the chaos that follows. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing who's traveling through history with me. Now, dim the lights. Let the hum of the room fade out. Close your eyes if you'd like. Tonight, we ride back to 1908, to the frozen banks of the Hudson River, where the future revved its engine and dared to begin. January 1908. The Hudson River was frozen over. Wind tore through the alleys like a blade. In the heart of Manhattan, a strange gathering took place, one that would ignite a tale of obsession, endurance, and madness. Beneath the gray skies, men stood huddled in long coats, their breath clouding the air. Top hats, leather goggles, wool scarves pulled high. On a cleared patch of snow-covered ground, 6 automobiles stood like alien creatures, crude, clunky, mechanical beasts with brass fittings and iron bones. They sputtered steam and coughed black smoke. The press was there, bundled up and shouting questions. A few hundred onlookers watched from the sidewalks, both amused and skeptical. A car race? In the dead of winter? Across the world? It was the dawn of the 20th century, and the future had wheels. They called it the Great Race, a madman's challenge from Le Matin, a French newspaper taken up by the New York Times. The course was obscene, from New York to Paris, overland, by car. Across the frozen United States, through Japan, Manchuria, the brutal wastes of Siberia, across Europe, and into France. Over 20,000 miles. The goal? To prove that the automobile, that new and noisy machine, was not a novelty, but a revolution. This was not a race of speed. It was a race of endurance, of national pride, and of technological hubris. They had no GPS, no satellite weather reports, no paved roads across the vast stretches of Asia, no refueling stations, sometimes not even maps. It was as if the Wright brothers had flown their fragile plane into a hurricane just to prove they could. And yet, 6 teams answered the call. George Schuster stood beside the American car, the Thomas Flyer. Stocky, square-jawed, with grease on his fingers and fire in his eyes. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't a politician. He was a mechanic, the kind who listened to engines like a doctor to a heartbeat. Born to German immigrants in Buffalo, New York, George had spent his teenage years elbow-deep in engines. He didn't just fix machines, he understood them. When he touched metal, it obeyed. But George was also a man of few words, a quiet patriot who believed deeply in the promise of American ingenuity. He wasn't supposed to drive the car, he was just the mechanic. But as others dropped out, faltered, gave up, George kept going. It would be George who carried the Thomas Flyer across frozen tundras and desert winds. He came to fix engines. He would leave a legend. Emilio Sirtori, representing Italy in the Zust, wore a dark overcoat buttoned high. His mustache was sharp, his eyes sharper. Every movement deliberate, like a man aware he was being watched. Emilio came from the northern hills of Italy, from a small town where pride ran deeper than blood. He had once been a cavalry officer, sharp and commanding, before turning his attention to automobiles, the new stallions of the 20th century. To Sirtori, the race was not just a competition, it was a duty. He wanted the world to see Italy as powerful, modern, noble. His team practiced ceremonial starts each morning. He would lecture his driver and co-driver with the precision of a general. But beneath the charm and pageantry was a dangerous rigidity. Emilio refused shortcuts, refused to back down, even when survival depended on it. He raced not for victory, but for an idea. And ideas do not bend. Hans Koeppen, the German captain, paced beside the protos. A Prussian cavalryman turned automobile enthusiast, Hans walked with a nobleman's confidence. He was a military man who saw the car as a weapon, another machine to master. He had fought duels in his youth, had served in remote outposts, and now brought that same grit to the great race. His mustache curled like an exclamation point. His boots were polished even in the snow. The German team came equipped with the most sophisticated car, lightweight frame, top-tier German engineering. But Hans was also deeply paranoid. He believed the other teams would cheat, that the Americans were being favored, that the French would lie. He kept journals obsessively. He carried maps scrawled with alternate routes. He trusted no one. He was prepared to win, but he was also prepared to burn bridges to get there. And then there was Godard, the Frenchman. Charles Godard was tall, whip-thin, and always grinning. The kind of man who lit cigarettes with charm, who spoke 5 languages but rarely said anything of substance. He wore a long coat that billowed behind him and seemed to float through crowds like a ghost. He wasn't the most experienced driver. In fact, he'd crashed 3 cars in the year prior. But he was the most confident. And when the crowd asked, "Can you really drive across the world?" he replied with a wink, "Why not?" Godard saw the race as theater, as a stage. He posed for photographs. He told reporters the French would arrive first, sipping wine and singing chansons. But beneath the performance was a man ill-prepared for the unforgiving terrain ahead. He laughed through every disaster, until the snow stopped laughing back. The other teams included a stoic pair from France in a monoblock and a crew of Norwegian Americans in a lesser-known car, the Zoost. But from the very beginning, it was clear, this was not a race of equals. The Americans, French, Italians, and Germans had the resources and the ego to push this madness forward. They stood at the starting line together, snow crunching underfoot, eyes fixed on the horizon, each believing, quietly, that the others would falter. They shook hands, not out of respect, but because that's what the newspapers expected. The mayor gave a speech. Someone fired a pistol in the air, and the engines roared. On February 12, 1908, the impossible began. They thought they could conquer the world with wheels and steel. They had no idea what was waiting for them beyond the edge of the map. Almost immediately, the world fought back. The streets of New York were an icy, muddy mess. Horse-drawn carriages splashed filthy water as the cars lurched forward, tires spinning uselessly. In Schenectady, barely 100 miles out, one of the French cars broke a front axle. They repaired it with a tree branch. In Albany, Godard took a wrong turn and got lost for hours. The Italian's radiator froze. The German car's engine stalled. There were no service stations. Every spare part had to be carried or improvised. Roads became fields. Fields became rivers. Every hour forward felt like a small miracle. The American team lost a full day trying to cross a frozen river. The Thomas Flyer fell through the ice and had to be winched out by a team of horses. They thought they were chasing glory. But what they'd caught was something else. Sleep became optional. Drivers would take turns collapsing in the snow while the others kept watch. Frostbite gnawed at fingers. Fuel froze in tanks. Sparks flew from iron tires as they scraped across frozen ground. There were moments of absurdity. A cow refused to move off the path and held up the Italian team for an hour. The German car plowed into a telegraph pole and had to be patched with tin from a biscuit box. Godard's team bribed a farmer for shelter, and the farmer fed them wine until they passed out. But the laughter never lasted long. By the time the teams reached Chicago, the race was no longer a race. It was a war of attrition. Local newspapers now printed headlines like "Car Corpses in the Midwest" and "Who Will Crawl into the Rockies?" Every team had lost something: time, men, hope. And ahead of them, the Rocky Mountains waited with cliffs and avalanches. The Nevada desert burned by day and froze by night. The Pacific Ocean, which they would have to cross, somehow, to reach Asia. 6 cars left New York. Only 3 would reach Paris. And none of the men would ever be the same. Fade to black. Distant sounds of wind, a lone engine sputtering in the snow. The dream began in snow. But by the time they left the American Northeast behind, the dream had begun to sink into the mud. The roads between New York and Chicago weren't roads at all. They were bogs, fields, and horse trails carved into frozen dirt by cartwheels and winter wagons. Car tires, built for city avenues, not wild terrain, spun uselessly in the muck. The Thomas Flyer, piloted by George Schuster, bounced through potholes as large as bathtubs. The Italian Zust lost its muffler in a ditch near Erie, Pennsylvania. The French de Dion stalled so often that locals began to call it Le Snail. Progress was measured not in hours, but in miles per day. Sometimes in feet per hour. The cars weren't just fighting nature. They were fighting sabotage. Rumors swirled. Nails scattered on dirt paths. Reports of teams deliberately misdirecting rivals. In one incident near Toledo, Ohio, the Americans discovered a pile of logs stacked purposefully across a narrow track, enough to break an axle if hit at speed. Hans Koeppen, the stiff-lipped Prussian captain of the German protos, denied any involvement. But whispers followed the Germans wherever they went. Hans, always cool and guarded, made no effort to soften the suspicion. Yet even German discipline was tested. By the time the teams limped into Chicago, the Windy City on March 1908, they were already weeks behind schedule. Engines sputtered, mechanics coughed from cold nights in barns and sheds. There were no cheering crowds anymore, just thin air, gaslight, and bone weariness. They thought the Midwest would be a reprieve. Instead, it was where dreams began to rot. In a brief interview with the Chicago Tribune, George Schuster, still wiping oil from his hands, said quietly, "People think we're chasing a trophy. We're chasing a road that doesn't exist." From Chicago to San Francisco, the illusion of modern America dissolved entirely. Towns vanished. Fuel stations, non-existent. The Wild West still breathed through broken fences and endless sky. South Dakota was a wasteland of wind and sun. Towns sat 300 miles apart. Every gallon of fuel had to be sent in advance by train, wagon, or even horseback. Still, crates went missing. In Nebraska, the protos sank axle-deep into an unplowed wheat field after Koeppen demanded a shortcut to bypass a storm. They lost 18 hours digging it out with shovels and wood planks. Let me take you to a parallel sequence of American team, Thomas Flyer. Schuster was now more than a driver. He was a surgeon, a priest, and a soldier. He drove 1,214 hours a day. The Flyer was held together by improvisation, wire mesh, melted bearings, parts scavenged from farm tools, and even a windmill gearbox. One night in Ogallala, Nebraska, the team stopped in a cattle shed. George wrote in his journal, "The cows gave more warmth than the stove. I slept beside the engine. I trust it more than I trust some of the men. In Laramie, Wyoming, a frost-covered sunrise revealed a broken axle and a fraying team of German protos. Koeppen screamed at his navigator, accusing him of missing a key turn. The German mechanic, a shy Bavarian named Max, sat down in the snow and quietly wept. By evening, Koeppen had ordered another shortcut. "We are not tourists," he snapped. But in the wild, arrogance is a map to nowhere. The Italians were now more myth than machine. Emilio Sirtori, still in a tailored overcoat, barked orders with military rigor. The others resented him, but obeyed. They refused shelter from American ranchers, choosing to sleep in barns rather than accept foreign pity. In Cheyenne, the Zust broke a spring mount. They repaired it with iron fencing and nails hammered flat with a rock. It worked, barely. No man shall say we begged our way to Paris. Charles Godard's French team, was unraveling. In Rock Springs, Wyoming, they spent 2 days gambling with miners and drinking wine Godard insisted they carry for morale. His mechanic vanished for a night. The next morning, Godard laughed. "We are behind, then we are ahead of failure." But the de Dion was breaking down faster than his confidence. In Utah, a fuel crate labeled for the Thomas Flyer went missing. George said nothing, but at the next checkpoint, he handed the German team a silent, ice-cold stare. In Nevada, the Italians refused to lend the French a jack after their car lost a wheel. In Wyoming, Max, the German mechanic, quit. He left a single note tucked into the passenger seat. "This is not a race. This is hell." Koeppen didn't comment. He simply closed the car door and drove on. Daylight boiled across the sand. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees. The Thomas Flyer, now more patchwork than factory, labored across the basin. A thunderclap of metal. Then, silence. The engine had blown a rod. A shaft of smoke curled into the sky. George climbed out slowly. Dust caked his face. His boots hissed in the heat. He knelt beside the engine as if mourning a friend. No towns, no water, no hope. The sun punished them. Coyotes watched from the hills. Hours passed. Then George said simply, "We don't die here." They walked 4 miles to find an abandoned French car, left behind after a breakdown 2 weeks earlier. From its carcass, they took a rusted radiator, a shredded belt, and a half-rotted wheel. Using copper wire, shirt sleeves, and kerosene-soaked bandages, George rewired the engine. He knelt, turned the crank, and whispered. The engine coughed, then roared. Sometimes, the difference between death and triumph is a single, stubborn breath. San Francisco, June 1908. The teams rolled into California, battered, torn apart, wiser. The Thomas Flyer arrived first. Its frame rattled. One headlamp was gone. The front bumper was wrapped in rope. The protos came hours later, leaking oil and trailing smoke. The Zust limped in next. Sirtori refused to look left or right. They had survived. That was enough. The de Dion never arrived. Godard's last known location was a ranch near Winnemucca. He would reappear weeks later, gaunt, drunk, unapologetic. They had crossed a continent and broken their illusions on every mile of it. But it wasn't over. Next, Japan, Siberia, Manchuria, Mongolia. They had to ship the cars across an ocean, learn new languages, find fuel in frozen tundra, and drive across the uncharted edges of Earth. The American West had shown them what men could endure. Asia would show them what they could not. They left the heat and dust of Nevada behind and sailed straight into a silence colder than death. Now, Let me take you to Japan." The racers docked in Yokohama, met with mild curiosity from locals who had never seen such crude, rattling machines. Japan, in the spring, was a land of cherry blossoms and ceremony. But the racers didn't come for beauty. They came to drive. Only, there were no roads, not like the ones they expected. In Tokyo, the cars were paraded briefly, like elephants in a circus, before being loaded onto flat cars for the rail journey north. The racers, impatient, were not allowed to drive on Japanese soil beyond a few dozen miles. Red tape, language barriers, and protective laws kept them fenced in. Emilio Sirtori, to a reporter, "We have not crossed America to sit on a train." The teams barely spoke to one another now. Old rivalries festered. The French were barely present. Their car had still not arrived. The Italians stewed in silence. The Germans demanded privilege. The Americans clenched their jaws and waited. Schuster spent his idle hours checking and rechecking the Thomas Flyer. He refitted spark plugs, reinforced the suspension, and cut leather strips to bind vulnerable wiring. He did not trust luck, only labor. From Japan, they sailed again, across the Sea of Japan, into a place whispered about, never prepared for, Vladivostok, eastern Siberia. This was where the map ran out. They called it Siberia, but it might as well have been another planet. The ground was frozen peat in some places, swampy hell in others. Spring melt had left the forests dripping and steaming, like some prehistoric bog. The Thomas Flyer sank within the first 20 miles. It took 8 hours to winch it out, using planks, rope, and all 6 hands on deck. Horses were borrowed from a nearby village to assist. The driver offered them cigarettes. They only laughed. Fuel was frozen. Tires split open. And the sun vanished for days at a time. The German protos broke a wheel outside Ussurisk. The nearest replacement was 1,000 miles away. They reforged a wheel rim out of a cast iron stove, melting and shaping it in a village blacksmith shed. The Italian Zust had lost its windshield entirely. They now drove wrapped in canvas and animal pelts, eyes squinting into freezing wind. Frost crusted their mustaches. Breaths became clouds. Ice crept into carburetors. Visual cue. Intercut slow, quiet shots. Engines struggling, ropes dragging metal over ice, boots breaking through shallow snow. They pushed the cars with ropes, literally pushed them, across frozen lakes where the ice cracked beneath them. They crossed Lake Kanka in silence. Each creak of the ice echoed like a cannon, each step a gamble. They slept inside the vehicles, engines running, for warmth. When they didn't, they risked freezing to death. More than once, George Schuster woke to frost creeping over his eyelashes. The Americans kept candles burning inside tin cans to detect carbon monoxide poisoning. It didn't always work. At night, they heard wolves. One morning, Emilio Sirtori fired his revolver into the darkness to drive off a pack circling the Zust. The Germans were chased for nearly half a mile along a logging trail by wolves. Koeppen wrote only, "We did not stop." Schuster once had to remove a frozen fuel line using only his teeth. His fingers no longer obeyed him. He cried silently behind his goggles. The race had long since stopped being about beating the others. Now it was about surviving longer than them. Fights broke out over rationing, over directions, over nothing. One American mechanic broke down crying after 3 nights without sleep. He was sent home on a supply sled. A German navigator collapsed with dysentery and was buried in a shallow grave, marked with a cross of ice. Koeppen stood over it, helmet off, for 5 silent minutes, then got back into the protos and ordered the engine started. The Italians lost a crate of tools after their sled capsized in the Amur River. Emilio refused to slow down. One of his men nearly froze to death that night. In the Zust, the driver stopped speaking. He simply nodded when told to turn. Emilio barked commands like a general in a lost war. In the end, they stopped calling each other names. They stopped calling each other anything. Outside Cheetah, a brutal snow squall hit the Thomas Flyer. Temperatures dropped below 30 degrees. Visibility, 0. The wind sounded like shrieking iron. George Schuster and fellow mechanic Montague Roberts tried to sleep in turns. One morning, George awoke and found Montague slumped, lips blue. He was gone. They buried him beneath a grove of trees, his body wrapped in a wool coat. The locals sang a hymn in Russian. George understood none of it, but he nodded in thanks. George didn't write that night, didn't speak for days. The flyer carried on. Frost does not care who you are or what you dream. In the white wasteland near Lake Baikal, tracks of the French de Dion trail off into nothing. Days pass, then weeks. No sign, no message, just empty snow, howling winds, and a growing silence on the radio. The French team is presumed dead. One Siberian trapper claimed to have seen a man with a French accent wandering near Irkutsk, muttering to himself. But when soldiers searched the area, they found only bear tracks. In Siberia, to vanish is to become part of the land. The snow remembers nothing. One morning, as the Thomas Flyer crawls over a frozen ridge, the sun cracks through the clouds. A warm wind blows. Beneath the ice, water begins to ripple. A sound, distant at first, of cracking, splintering. A reminder, spring is coming. They thought winter would kill them. They didn't know what came next. After the ice came politics, and politics knew no mercy. As the Thomas Flyer, the Protos, and the Zust creaked westward toward Europe, they entered a Russia on August 1908, seething with unrest. The 1905 revolution had left wounds. Railways were guarded, villagers were wary, and Tsarist soldiers watched every move. The landscape had changed from raw wilderness to controlled chaos. Trains passed by with armed guards. Posters of Tsar Nicholas II hung beside barbed wire. The racers weren't just curiosities here. They were intrusions. At every checkpoint, they were questioned, searched, delayed. One Russian officer pulled George Schuster aside and demanded their papers, their route, even their personal correspondence. When George protested, the officer put a hand to his pistol and said, "Spies are shot, racers are delayed." In Siberia, nature tried to kill them. In Russia, men took its place. The Germans, unbothered, sailed through. Hans Koeppen smiled in his Prussian uniform, crisp and proud. It carried weight here. Later, Schuster wrote, "We are watched not as guests, but as threats. This land does not care for our race, only for our obedience." Then, like a ghost, they reappeared. The French de Dion. Scarred, tattered, but intact. Charles Godard stumbled into a telegraph office in Omsk, laughing deliriously. He claimed they'd found a better route. What he didn't say, but others quickly found out, was that much of that route had been via railroad flat car. Photos emerged, witnesses spoke, telegrams flew. They had survived the cold, but not with honor. The scandal exploded. French newspapers tried to shield them, but the damage was done. In a hotel lobby in Kazan, Godard confronted Schuster. "I am here, am I not? We all do what we must." Not long after, the Zust died. The engine, fatigued, patched, rusted from the salt air and frozen nights, blew apart on a rocky trail near Perm. Steam poured from the hood like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sirtori stared at the wreck. He said nothing for a long time. They quit the race. He telegraphed Turin, "Glory is not worth this." The Italian flag was folded. The car was abandoned. Their dream buried in gravel and oil. Then came a twist. In St. Petersburg, just weeks from the finish, a miscommunication shook the entire US team. A telegram from a race official in Paris misidentified the Thomas Flyer's position and implied they had used rail transport from Harbin to Irkutsk, a completely false claim. Rumors spread. The Protos team seized on it. Hans Koeppen said to journalists, "It is obvious. They are no more honest than the French." In St. Petersburg, Schuster panicked. They wired affidavits from Russian border agents, photos of their route, even written statements from local mayors. George wrote letter to wife, "I feel madness creeping in. I fix what I can fix. But this is lies on wires." Every glance from a bystander became suspicion. Every stop for fuel, a potential trap. They kept driving. The end was near. But now, they no longer looked like men trying to win. They looked like men escaping something. George Schuster, normally composed, began muttering to himself. He questioned the logic of the race, the idea of first place. The race is no longer a race, it's survival. He no longer shaved, no longer spoke at dinner. He fixed the car with glazed eyes, bleeding hands. The Germans, meanwhile, grew bolder. The Protos began skipping rest stops. They used horses to tow the car uphill at night. Once, Koeppen bribed a local to guide them off-road, shaving dozens of miles. To win is to be remembered. How you win is often forgotten. As they entered Poland, crowds gathered, not to cheer, but to gawk. They looked like vagabonds, eyes sunken, clothes soiled. They had crossed the edge of the world and come back with ghosts behind their eyes. In Germany, Koeppen was greeted by military officials. Trumpets played. He smiled, but Schuster saw it, the empty gaze of a man who no longer knew why he'd started. By Belgium, word came. The French had quietly withdrawn. Only 2 teams remained: Thomas Flyer, Protos. The Americans pushed harder. Through rain, through hunger, through aching bones. One final breakdown outside Reims almost ended it: a broken spring. Schuster spent 12 hours fabricating a new one from fencing wire. And then, at last, Paris, July 30th, 1908. The Thomas Flyer rolled beneath the Arc de Triomphe. Horns sputtering, flags tied to the radiator. Crowds screamed, hats flew, cameras flashed. They had won, or so they thought. At the hotel that night, a telegram from the race organizers. The French government refused to certify the victory unless the Americans could prove they had driven every mile, especially in Asia. There are many ways to kill a man. One is to take his triumph and question it. George, in a letter to race committee, wrote, "We carried our car when it would not move. We ate snow when food ran out. We buried a friend in frozen soil. And now you doubt us? There was no glory, only road, and the road is never fair." Part 5. The Last Mile Home. The disputed miles in Manchuria, where the French had used rail and the Germans claimed unfair advantage, needed to be proven. So the Americans did the unthinkable. They turned around. The Thomas Flyer, wheels bent, suspension warped, was driven back over the same brutal landscape, over 1,000 additional miles through Russia and Asia. It was no longer a race. It was a penance. Locals stared in disbelief. They had already passed this way. Why were they back? The skies darkened again. Autumn approached. Rivers rose. They repaired their own bridges, fought off sickness. At one point, the team ran out of gasoline and distilled vodka from local potatoes to keep the engine running. Back in Europe, the home stretch. But the land didn't care. Rain turned dirt to sludge. Entire roads vanished into muck. Every village smelled like wet ash and horse sweat. What should have been triumph was torment. Schuster no longer spoke unless spoken to. His hands trembled when he ate. He walked with a limp from frostbite. Let me take you to a brief memory. Montague Roberts, once co-driver of the Thomas Flyer, smiling as he tunes a carburetor. A frostbitten morning in Siberia. Roberts lying beneath blankets, unmoving. George said softly, "He said he wanted to be remembered, not like this." The finish line, Paris, August 17, 1908. No crowds this time, no press, no trumpets. Just George Schuster, grease-streaked, clothing torn. He guides the Thomas Flyer to a silent halt in front of the Le Matin newspaper office, the final checkpoint. A clerk emerges, signs a paper, nods. That was it. He left as a mechanic. He returned as a legend and a ghost. Hans Koeppen, celebrated in Berlin for a time, faded into military obscurity. Charles Godard disappeared entirely. Emilio Sirtori became a mechanic in Naples, never raced again. Only Schuster, silent and reluctant, was remembered. Not for glory, but for endurance. He went home, opened a small garage, and never spoke of the race again, except to say, the 1908 New York to Paris race changed history. Though forgotten by many, it proved that cars, and the men who drove them, could span continents. It laid the groundwork for intercontinental highways, for military logistics, for the idea of the world as reachable, if not conquerable. It was a testament to ego, yes, but also to grit and futility. They raced for pride, for countries, for headlines. But what they found was themselves. It was a race that no one sane would attempt, but that changed the world forever. Thomas Flyer completed 22,000 miles in 169 days. Only 3 of 6 cars finished. George Schuster died in 1972, aged 99. He never raced again. Today, we think of races as sport, precision, speed, technology. But in 1908, there was only grit and the road. The New York to Paris race was not just a feat of endurance, it was a preview of the future. Before the Thomas Flyer ever rolled into Paris, most people believed the automobile was a novelty, something for parades, a toy for the rich. But this race, brutal, chaotic, and unprecedented, forced the world to reconsider. Narrator: if a car could cross continents, what else could it do? After 1908, car manufacturers saw a new path: test their machines in real-world hell and prove their superiority. By the 1910s, the Indianapolis 500 was born, not just as a spectacle, but as a testing ground for tire endurance, fuel efficiency, and engine power. Ray Harroun, driving the Marmon Wasp in 1911, won the first official race using a rear-view mirror, a modest innovation that would become standard in all cars. By the 1920s, Europe hosted the first Grand Prix races, laying the foundation for what would become Formula One. One legend stood out: Tazio Nuvolari, the Italian daredevil who dominated the 1930s. A man so fearless, he once finished a race with a broken leg. Ford versus Ferrari, 1960s. Perhaps the most legendary transformation in racing history wasn't technological, it was psychological. It was about pride and revenge. In the early 1960s, Enzo Ferrari declined a business deal with Henry Ford II, humiliating the American company. In response, Ford launched a massive racing program, not to build better road cars, but to beat Ferrari where it mattered most: the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Under the leadership of engineer Carroll Shelby and driver Ken Miles, the Ford GT40 became a weapon. In 1966, it didn't just win, it dominated. 3 GT40s crossed the finish line together. It was a corporate flex, a story of industrial ego fueling racing excellence. The Ford vs. Ferrari saga redefined what racing could mean to the public, no longer just about speed, but identity, nationalism, and narrative. It wasn't just a race, it was a war. And like all wars, it left casualties. Ken Miles died shortly after, testing a new prototype. But his ghost rides with every underdog team that dares to take on giants. Senna's death and the safety revolution, 1994. By the 1990s, Formula One had become a global spectacle. Fast, glamorous, and wildly dangerous. Then came Imola, 1994. Ayrton Senna, considered by many the greatest driver in history, crashed during the San Marino Grand Prix. His car veered off at 100 mph and hit a concrete wall. He was killed instantly. The world stopped. Brazil mourned like a nation had fallen. Senna's death was the final straw in a series of tragedies that year. The FIA, Formula One's governing body, overhauled safety regulations. Cockpit designs were modified. Circuits were restructured with wider runoffs. The Hans device, head and neck support, was introduced. Today, Formula One is almost unrecognizable compared to the 1990s in terms of safety. And yet, the thrill remains. From blood came reform, and from reform, respect. Senna's death changed the soul of the sport. It reminded the world that speed is sacred, but never without cost. The electrification era, 2014 to 2025. As the 21st century advanced, a different kind of urgency arrived: climate change. Racing, once a symbol of roaring engines and fossil fuels, had to adapt. In 2014, Formula E launched, an all-electric series racing through global city centers. At first mocked, it grew into a proving ground for electric vehicle tech. Formula One followed, introducing hybrid turbo power units, and by 2025, cars run on 100% sustainable fuels. Even endurance racing has evolved. Hydrogen-powered prototypes now race in Le Mans trials. Solar-powered rally cars have crossed the Australian outback. This new era isn't slower, it's smarter. It began with vodka fuel in a Siberian forest. Now it runs on sunlight, silence, and the same hunger to push forward. As racing entered the new millennium, everything changed. Telemetry began sending data live from the cars. Carbon fiber saved lives with ultra-strong safety cells. Hybrid engines appeared in F1 by 2014, and by 2025, all Formula One cars run on sustainable fuels. Legends of the modern era: Michael Schumacher, 7-time world champion, known for his relentless work ethic. Lewis Hamilton, who broke records while using his platform to speak for justice. Sebastian Loeb, 9-time world rally champion, who conquered tarmac and gravel alike. Now, electric series like Formula E and endurance events with hydrogen-powered prototypes show that racing still leads technology, just like the Thomas Flyer once did. George Schuster never sought legacy, but he earned it. Today, the Thomas Flyer is preserved in the National Automobile Museum in Nevada. Modern engineers still marvel at how it survived. No GPS, no suspension, no sealed roads, just leather, gears, and guts. Every Formula One driver, every rally champion, every young boy or girl dreaming behind a steering wheel owes a silent debt to that winter morning in 1908. From iron-banded wheels to carbon titanium wings, from vodka-fueled engines to net-zero fuel hybrids, from two men in a car with no map to entire teams running simulations in real time. But at its core, the story remains the same. Risk, rivalry, reach beyond what seems possible. They raced for pride, for countries, for headlines. But what they found was themselves. There are races for trophies, and races that change the world. Only one began in New York, ended in Paris, and stretched across time.